Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, where we explore emerging trends and cultural phenomena to help you update your mental models of how the world is changing. And for this month of December, we got some specials for you. We got two really interesting conversations lined up. But before we release them in the next weeks, we wanted to take today to have more of a conversational episode talking about our highlights of this year.
Some of them.
Not all of them. Welcome to a 5-hour podcast. So we're going to have some podcast episodes because, gotta have to talk about podcasts on a podcast. And we're going to have some essays and interviews and just see what we find interesting, what we will recommend. Note that we go into the quieter period of the year, which I think here in Germany is not going to be very quiet with an election coming up. It's going to be fun, but if you find some time to listen or hear to listen to things or read things, we have some recommendations. Igor, you want to get us started?
Sure. Yeah. Welcome back from my side as well. It is December, and so it is time for retrospection, I guess. Seeing how we've been doing this since over 6 months, I've really felt like that at least what we can do is also reference some other stuff that we found really interesting and valuable. If you follow me on Instagram or other platforms, you probably have seen me recommending a Talkeasy episode, and there is some good reason for that. I think, as I was discussing with Johannes before, I obviously didn't listen to all of the interview podcasts that are out there, but judging by the way how rather famous people are talking to Sam and how they're expressing more than once, actually really like every other episode, that sensation of having the most intimate or most surprising and most thoughtful interview that they have done in their careers, which all of those people do quite often and regularly, or as was the case with the episode of a week ago with Jesse Eisenberg, who barely does any interviews, and who was expressing how this was very much a session quite like no other, and it was mostly therapy, and that he would be willing to come back every week to do this if it would mean that he doesn't have to pay his therapist. Yes, listen to the episode with Jesse Eisenberg, but to be sure, I really enjoyed a lot of different episodes, and I'm not going into all the details about them. But Winston Cunningham, Lily Gladstone, and also just for the voice alone, Josh Brolin, whose book they discuss in the episode. But this book is an autobiography of Josh Brolin himself, which has this amazing story. It's like this very pure American cowboy story that you can probably only have in America. I've definitely bought that book as an audiobook because he reads it himself, and I want to go to bed listening to Josh Brolin.
It's like he has one of those voices where you want to make a joke about, I could listen to him read the telephone book, but I don't think that joke lands anymore.
No,
because if he uses telephone books, what is a telephone?
It's like, my kids will be like, this is not funny.
Yeah.
So, but honestly, if you like listening to rather famous people, because it's a lot of them are artists, mostly filmmakers, actors. There's a lot of politics in it. I kind of used to skip political kind of sections of Talkeasy because I didn't want to listen to too much American politics, because that makes you usually kind of sad. But even those episodes, he has this ability to go into this being both angry and allowing people to extract some of their thoughts in a way that you probably haven't heard before, which is a unique kind of way of presenting both insight that is relatable. And I think that's something that is very unique to Sam's approach doing interviews. They're both emotionally and kind of like information-wise very insightful, because you can see yourself in the conversation somehow. It's not just you taking in information, it's you relating to this through the conversation. I think that's something that's very unique to him.
Actually, it's a good point, because I always really liked his political episodes because I somehow got a lot of like insight from them. And I think your point is spot on, that the difference is that he's not approaching it from a rational point of view, which I think has been the problem over the last years with like a more like mainstream or even left of center media trying to make sense of something that seems ridiculous to most of us. And he much more like went for the emotion, the feeling, the gut feeling kind of things. And through this, I think is better in like uncovering why for now America really moved so far into that direction. For me, it's always a good part is it seems to be like Germany following very slowly behind an American trajectory, so makes it easier to predict.
As we always do for the last
there you go
couple of decades.
And that's why I find it interesting. Yeah, it's a good part.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about obviously like third culture this year, and Sam being also of third culture. Or
can you quickly explain what that means?
Well, third culture third culture kids is a term that was coined in the 70s, and it's when kids of parents. So basically, you have parents; they provide one culture, and then the kids are second culture, or the parents take you as a kid in your formative years to a place that is not the home place of your parents, and that place is the second culture, and through the culture of your parents and the place that you grow up in, you form a third culture. So technically, Sam is not a third culture kid because he just grew up in California. His parents are with diverse background, and I think for me, what is super interesting about his approach is that he always incorporates what is kind of a meta-modern approach to looking at things. It's an informed naivety in their sense that he is never shying away of looking at things as they are, but remains able to sustain a form of emotional kind of like ability to still go forward and still kind of like embrace change and embrace things as they come. So it doesn't hold him back from doing things. It's allowing him to kind of like do it in a more passionate way, in a way. So I think like that for me is certainly a podcast. I mean, to be honest, this is the first podcast that I always listen in a week. Like it's released on Sunday. If I don't hear anything else this week, this is the one I will be listening to. And that's obviously a recommendation from my side. Do you want to go next with an essay, or should I continue?
Yeah, might make sense to go back and forth. So my first recommendation actually is an interview that is not even from this year. It's from July 22. Was conducted by Leon Becker with Elvia Wilk and Claire L. Evans, which are like just like these two names combined in a conversation. You already know it's going to go deep. So they are both very much involved with science fiction writing. In Claire Evans, and in this context, just brought out a new collection of science fiction writing. Via Wilk was about to release her book Death by Landscape, which I can highly recommend if you're looking for a book to challenge you to like really go into, as she would say, the new weird. Like it's like from the last 5 years, like one of my top 3 books that I read. And it's a collection of essays that really provide a lot of new perspectives. And so they both sat down with Leon Becker to talk about going beyond dystopias. I mean, it was like right at the end of the COVID pandemic. And they were wondering, like now that the world had gone through like this like global crisis, what would that actually mean for like dystopian writing? And I think the interesting part is like they started like going into this idea of science fiction really not being about predictions anymore. I mean, they also argue that it never really was, but they also really make the sense that basically tech companies have taken over the part of like trying to predict certain futures. And they say like they're really interested. So that opens for them, like in general, like opens new possibilities for science fiction writing. And they say or talk about that fiction is actually rather bad at like forecasting things, but it's much better at conveying an emotional experience of future scenarios, which I think is a huge point, that you read science fiction not to get a forecast of where the future might go, but much more like what does that feel like if we explore that, like more from an emotional exploration of these kind of topics. Like one of the quotes is, one of the more interesting ways out is to think about science fiction in terms of effect, not as something that is necessarily prescriptive or predictive, but instead focusing on the sensations it evokes: unease, revulsion, attraction, dread. I think it's a good way to get into those emotions.
But so, I mean, I have this running theory that you can understand the psyche of any of those big tech company CEOs and founders by looking at which kind of science fiction books they have read when they were teenagers. And, you know, like starting with Snow Crash, if you follow, like the question connected to this part, to this kind of like insight is for me, what is it that happens, I guess, in a teenager or aka sociopath, or I don't know, like basically what is it that happens when you read Snow Crash and you're like, I'm 30, I have all the money in the world, let's build this. Like what is the insight that's missing then emotionally, I guess? Because I think like anyone who reads Snow Crash understand that it's a dystopia, but I would argue that the reason why Neil Stephenson and William Gibson were successful because they created an aesthetic in their books through the kind of world building that they do that allowed to ignore the emotional maybe downsides of the world's discussed. So it's an interesting point of view, because like how do you avoid that trap of making it emotionally enticing instead of the other way around?
Yeah, and they like explicitly also address this problem. I mean, that was also, I think, like a year ago, Charles Stross did a keynote about like the torment nexus, like this fictitious device that somebody builds in, like a science fiction author writes into a novel, and tech companies go like don't, and the whole novel is about not building the torment nexus, and tech companies immediately going, oh, we built the torment nexus. So I have one quote here where they say the tech sector is very good at divorcing aesthetics from politics, or pretending that they have nothing to do with one another. One person's dystopia can very easily become somebody else's prophet. The level of delusion or optimism built into product development is just so fundamental to the way people think about progress and improvement. It seems like it's possible to be obsessed with Hollywood dystopias that depict things like totalitarian surveillance states to scare yourself with those stories, and yet also completely believe in the potential of technology to help us avoid disaster. We are good at ignoring these contradictions, or just as bad embracing them. So yeah, that's our big problem in here.
Well, I think that's a good segue to the episode that I want to recommend. And it's an episode in the podcast Odd Lot. I think we probably should do an extensive description with links for this episode so that you can follow up.
Links in the show notes.
In the show notes. I like saying that. Anyway, I don't actually listen to this podcast. It's a little bit too much on the finance side of things, but in this particular episode, the theory that explains why everyone went crazy caught my attention. A good title, and the episode does its justice. And in this episode, they talk about a very kind of like decision things. So it's a very interesting term when you think about who is helping the next president in the United States make the government more lean. And I think like what I really took away from it is that component that we have as society have often a hard time trusting systems that we cannot physically verify. And so that relationship to cognitive load and how we comprehend things. So basically, how did our ability evolve to really comprehending complex systems? And if we don't understand them, what does it create? And throughout the year, I was thinking a lot about kind of like what that episode has kind of triggered in me. So it's, or more specifically, Dan Davis's book that they discuss in it about like the theory of how big systems make terrible decisions. And I have this kind of like running theory that the cognitive load that people who make decisions are exposed to right now prevents them from exercising the agency that they actually have. So it's not that nobody has agency, it's that they actually cannot tap into the agency that they actually have. They're constantly overwhelmed. And what people who make decisions actually require is not necessarily new inspiration or new information. It is spaces, often actually physical spaces, that allow people some clarity and some ability to lower the cognitive loads that can make decisions by themselves. And the reason why I was also thinking a lot about this is because Johannes and I, right in the beginning of January of this year, went with a client to a 2-day workshop in the mountains of Austria, where literally on the top of a mountain, we spent 2 days with the whole management team of an insurance in Germany and helped them define a vision of their company. And you can definitely see what happens with people if you kind of take them out of their normal system and spend some time, because on the first half of the first day, you definitely still work against the kind of like the thing that they are used to. But with time, you kind of like the system falls apart and they're able to suspend their disbelief about the things that are never possible and create a story that they actually want to pursue. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will or that there are not any other obstacles in their way. That's not the point. Point is, how do we actually get to a point where we at least are able to formulate something that is interesting enough for us to pursue it, maybe against our own better judgment in a way. And so I think like this episode about how we are unable to create decisions because we are just too exposed to too many complex things, and thus making us kind of like unable to make decisions because we're constantly aware that there is no way that our decision can be the right one.
I think that's we're going to stay with this topic of agency for a bit, I think, in this episode. And I think the perfect example of someone who does exactly what you just described, of removing agency by going super broad and super high level, is Yuval Harari, who this year wrote a new book. I think Nexus, it's called.
Isn't he writing like every year a new book or something?
Not really.
Yeah.
But so he wrote a new book. It's another book about AI, these kind of topics. And my recommendation is a review in The Atlantic by Daniel Immerwahr, who beautifully rips into him. I mean, just to like give you one quote, he shares with Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, and Slavoj Žižek a zeal for theorizing widely, though he surpasses them in his taste for provocative simplification. So
was it rightly or widely?
Potato, I guess. So yeah, it's widely, but yeah. So Harari has this really strange part where he's like, as you might know, like meditates 2 hours a day and really doesn't read much in current like discussions or things like that, and then just throws out these like large works that make very, very broad statements. And it's interesting if you look at them from exactly what you just described. Like he uses all these kind of different stylistic elements. Like he always talks a very random we. It's never clear who he means. Like, does he mean we as humans, as the world, as global, or just like Silicon Valley or historians? I think he still considers himself a historian. And so he makes these really broad strokes, and by thus really removing any of like concrete agency. There's like one line in the article where it says, "But just as it is possible to be too narrowly focused and miss the forest for the trees, it is also possible to be too zoomed out and miss the forest for the solar system," which I think is spot on. For me, the really interesting part with Harari is that he is positioning himself as a critic of Silicon Valley, and then always pretends to be surprised when he is constantly invited by Silicon Valley, and all like tech founders quote his work and refer to him, and book him for like keynotes and things like that. And I think it shows it's a good example of how like if you just like find the right like framing, even the people you supposedly criticize feel valued by you. So I think this is a good example of that, because he never really, like, for example, attacks Silicon Valley or like especially like the AI focused startups and telling them, no, we need to do this differently, or you have a responsibility or stuff like that. He always keeps it so broad and so global that nobody is really approached with that. It also I think like readers come away from his book very much like, oh, we might be fucked, but there's nothing we can do about it. There's no way where we can like direct our rage or something like that. And that for me is always really interesting. Like the last, there's like one more quote from the article is, "Although flesh and blood, Harari is Silicon Valley's ideal of what a chatbot should be. He rates libraries, detects the patterns, and boils all of history down to the bullet points." I think that's...
but is that the reason why he's so successful?
Yeah. I think it's like this. It's this, everybody can like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Feel informed, but not gain agency.
Exactly. I mean, it started from the very first of his book, which was very much like this
Homo sapiens. Something?
Yeah, Homo sapiens, I think it was the one, Sapiens.
Or Sapiens.
Where it's interesting, like if you speak to actual historians about his work, they all said it's completely bullshit. You can't do like generalize like this, just doesn't work. And he just doesn't care. He just tells his story. There's very little to prove his story, or it's based on little research, very little research. It's just like too much of a generalization. So it's also really hard to attack it. And he always does that. And he always does it from a perspective, or make it sound like, oh yeah, obviously it's how it is. And so it becomes like folk to everyone who reads these books. And I think so. That's why I think it's a perfect example of how he actually takes away agencies, because he refers to like large forces that are never really clear or defined, and thus makes it impossible. And also like even his recommendations of how to like do something about it are never like specific to certain actors or stakeholders who actually could do something about that. And so because I saw so many recommendations for Nexus, I thought it's was very glad to read in The Atlantic a much more like precise critique of what the problem is with his writing.
Right, yeah. I think so. The next one that I am recommending is actually, I mean, kind of a little bit on the nose, but it stayed with me and kind of shaped also a good chunk of my thinking for this year, is a conversation between Kyle Chayka and Ezra Klein. And to start a little bit lighter note and kind of make fun a little bit of Ezra, it's like a lot of this episode is kind of strange, because Ezra Klein is such a dork when it comes to kind of expressing kind of like how he shapes his tastes. And the episode is actually, I don't know what the exact name was again. We'll look it up, but it's like, how is your shaping kind of like developed or something like that. And they discuss Kyle's book, Filter World, and it is about what Kyle kind of was talking about, what we talked about in like the episode that we also did with him.
It's how to discover your own taste.
How to discover your own taste, exactly. And so listening to Ezra discovering his ability to talk about his own taste after like rebranding himself with his tattoo on the cover of his podcast now, and it seems like he wants to show that he's kind of cool too, and it's adorable but also a little bit strange, like listening to your own dad kind of like discover something new.
You know he's younger than you, right?
I actually know, but he behaves like he isn't. But that episode, so they're discussing a lot of things, discussing basically Kyle's book and how algorithms and how we discover things and how those algorithms that kind of maintain our discovery are influencing what we consider as taste, and that flattening of taste, that why everything looks the same, why all those things are coming together the way they do. And they end up on, like, it's hard, the later part of the episode, I think like the last third, it's actually a term that Ezra says that happens when you experience personalization all the time, and how we create it in all kinds of environments for ourselves. And that is personalized culturescapes. That term really stuck with me. And it actually reminded me also of an article that Ian Bogus wrote about AirPods, I think like about the time when they were released for the first time, so quite a while ago. And I do wear them, but for the longest time, I didn't have AirPods because of that article. I will admit it. Like, I thought the first ones were aesthetically just impossible to wear, but the new ones, the long kind of like, that was like a no-no. But honestly, I think like if I wouldn't have read Ian Bogus's article, I might have even overlooked that part and got them. But his point about, and I'm still observing that in my own behavior, his point about people wearing them while talking to other people, and that kind of like that thing where you create a physical representation of your choice to retreat into your own personal culturescape. He didn't coin it that way, but that was something that I basically took away from that conversation between Kyle and Ezra. That ability to create for ourselves those personal spaces is what makes us a little bit, or not a little bit, makes us quite antisocial. So personalization is something that is, I'm not being dramatic here, but it's like tearing us a little bit apart, because we retreat in those kind of super individualized spaces of, this is how I want my music to be, this is how I want my light to be, this is like, everything needs to be personalized. But the problem about that, and that kind of like, that's not something necessarily discussed in the episode, the problem that I see is that we exposing ourselves to a world where we have to make decisions all the time. Those are micro decisions, but they're decisions nonetheless. And that is kind of like, if you think about it as an overall capacity to making decisions, because we have like those personal spaces that we have to curate and maintain and always make sure that they're exactly the right thing. And that means I actually have to know what exactly the right thing is for me at any point. We diminish our ability to make decisions that are actually, that we actually have to make, because we are constantly making some really stupid small decision about how to create our own personal personal culturescapes. And that obviously also, not obviously, but that's something. So I wrote an updated version based on that episode about something that I wrote about like 2016 about denial of future attacks. So it's like from a denial of a service attack, like a version of our inability to make future decisions because we're denied the ability to make and think what is right for us. And I think a lot of that is captured in those kind of like micro decisions that are exhausting our ability to make the kind of decisions that we need to really think about with more capacity to make them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of like, that triggered a lot of thinking for this year, this episode.
And I mean, I find it interesting, like also like connecting it with the episode we did with Kyle is that there's actually a point to be made, and I think he makes him also in his book, is even if you think about like your personalized culture scapes, is that they're not really yours.
Yeah. No.
I mean, I think that's the part, is like you think, oh, I've made all this like taste-based decisions about what I like and what I don't like, but most of the time they're just like the stuff that's suggested to you, and you say yes and no, but it's not really like you're creating that. It's just because you're listening to like your recommended music playlist from Spotify doesn't mean
yours.
it's like it's personalized for you, not really by you.
And its Spotify example is really funny, because later, like in the years, Kyle wrote an article about why he quit Spotify.
Yeah.
And that is because the algorithm keeps recommending all the same things over and over again, because obviously they have to push certain like business decisions into how they personalize your culture scape, which is not yours in the first place. So yeah.
And so I think that is like one big driver of like our like fatigue with anything like digital, algorithm based, personalized. I mean, we also talked in the episode with him about how it bleeds over into the physical world, and how a lot of like physical experiences are now very much influenced by an like algorithm culture.
But you know what? Let's stay a little bit on that. And I think like that also connects that the more personalized or supposedly personalized our kind of experiences become, the more we crave those third places where we come together. And I think that's kind of like what drove a lot of the insight in our previous seasons. Like, we have this kind of juxtaposition between that ability to create super personalized digital environments where everything needs to be just exactly the way we want it to be, but also crave this communal experience where we are not in control, or not like don't have to exercise control. It's something that is happening to us in a way because we expose ourselves. And, you know, like that ability of understanding that narrative is, I guess, something that certain politicians made very good profit of. And others misunderstood what is rallying people together. And I think you can criticize Trump for a lot of things, but understanding a certain psyche in society with a certain group of people is certainly something that he can do quite well. And he recognizes kind of like that need in people to come together and maybe suspend their disbelief or suspend their rational thinking, suspend kind of a lot of the information that is available about his actions. So I think it's a very kind of like interesting space in which we inhabit, like where we on the one hand have issues with personalization, but then we tend to also go to the other extreme and suspend kind of like our, like in a collective, suspend our ability to rationally understand what is happening as a group behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was always also to a certain extent the appeal of being in a mass of people, like in a group of people, and might just be like being at a football game and enjoying chanting with 100,000 people or something like that. I think there's what I found it really interesting wasn't aware before we like dug into it throughout the podcast, like how much current developments are like really informed by our experience of the pandemic, of how like we really have like never, maybe not even like rationally, but understood like what was missing, and that there is a value and the comfort to having places that you can just go to that are very low barrier to entry, and things would just happen. You don't have to bring anything. You don't have to prepare. You don't have to have read all the right stuff and things like that. And you can just be there, and it's like different experiences. And I find that interesting. Like, and that brings me to my last recommendation. For me, another thing that was really interesting that connects us to Harari again is this year I thought a lot about the performativity of criticism, where we know, like, and I can very much look at my own network and myself over the last years, where especially like in like tech criticism, there's just like a very learned behavior. Like, a tech company does something and instinctively you like criticize it for what it does and how bad it is and how much surveillance there is and things like that. And it's just like a learned behavior. Like, there's actually not any like new insight. I think there's a
Very
lot of
learned behavior by us too.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of like Substacks that just based on whatever they do, I will criticize it in like the most bad faith perspective that is possible. And it just feels like it's now like basically an ecosystem of like tech enthusiasts and tech criticism and things like that. And so I'm always like interested in the space in between, or more interested now than I used to be in the space in between, because for me, it feels like this is not getting us anywhere. The instinctively criticizing on a very broad level, that's also the other part. It's always on a very high level where the criticism is, so that there's very little that you can actually do about it. And so there's an article this year from Matt Klein. I think Matt Klein is the chief foresight expert or futurist from Reddit. He's doing a lot of like trend research and also has a newsletter.
He had also a very wrong report about third places.
Yeah. It's definitely not always. So I always like always read it with a critical perspective, critical mind. But this one I just found interesting because so he said the article is unplugging is not the solution you want, and so it like brings together for me Harari and this sort of criticism and what we just talked about with personalized culture scapes and the algorithm culture is like there's like a strong tendency now, like as also with Twitter and everything going to shit, to just detach. And I mean, like digital detoxes has been a term that has been around for quite some time. And he makes the point in that is first and foremost not working. You can do some like I don't look at Instagram on the weekend, and you're like, okay, but does that like really solve anything? Does that help anything and stuff like that?
Tell that to the guy with a typewriter in a coffee place that I've seen this weekend.
Yeah, it's performative. And also like, I mean, who has the privilege to detach from digital systems, who's like dependent on them and things like that. And so he's really looking for the middle ground, for a more mindful or curious approach, where it's more about reflecting and seeing how we can actually live with that without being controlled by that and without just escaping from that. And he has this quote, which I think like really sums up well this whole notion on agency that we've been going on about today, about agency will come from curiosity, questioning, and understanding, not removal, ignorance, or denial. And I think that's a good way to bring it to an end and finish our recommendations.
Indeed. We hope you found this interesting, insightful, or at least suspenseful.
Yeah, if you enjoy these like more conversation oriented podcasts, we're trying to think about for next year, like how we combine more these like well researched, in depth, like looking into certain trends and aspects and the more conversations between Igor and me.
We would, and also other people. So it's you can shape a little bit of our thinking in that regard for the next year for sure. If you let us know what you think about this episode, and if you want more recommendations like that, because strap on, we have many. With that, we thank you for listening as always. If you thought this was interesting, do like it and rate it and recommend it to someone who you think would profit from it. And see you on the next one.
Yeah, so if you let us know, you can write us an email at ftr@knownunknowns.xyz. And yeah, Follow the Rabbit is a Known Unknowns production, and is hosted by Igor and me, Johannes. Have a good one. We'll catch up in the next one. Bye.
Bye.